Jack stepped into the passageway, his breath visible in the freezing air. His footsteps echoed unnervingly as he made his way down the narrow corridor. The deeper he went, the more oppressive the darkness became. His flashlight flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. After what felt like an eternity, Jack reached the end of the passageway. He found himself standing in front of a large stone chamber. The walls were lined with ancient-looking carvings, and at the center of the room was a stone altar, covered in dust and cobwebs. Jack approached the altar cautiously. Something about the room felt wrong. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and the temperature had dropped even further. Jack's flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw something moving in the shadows. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the chamber, extinguishing his flashlight. Jack's heart raced as he stood there in total darkness. The room was silent, except for the faint sound of his own breathing.
I need to get out of here.
As Jack fumbled to turn his flashlight back on, he heard something, a faint whisper, coming from the shadows. His blood ran cold as the whisper grew louder, turning into a low, guttural moan. Jack's hands trembled as he finally managed to flick his flashlight back on, illuminating the chamber. There, standing at the far end of the chamber, was the pale woman. Her eyes, dark and hollow, glowed faintly in the light. Her body seemed to shimmer, as if she were made of mist. She moved toward Jack slowly, her feet barely making a sound on the stone floor.
No, stay away from me.
The pale woman's smile widened, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. Her face twisted into something grotesque, something inhuman. Jack backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to run, but his legs felt heavy, as if the very air in the chamber was weighing him down. The woman reached out with one hand, her fingers long and claw-like. As she approached, the whispering voices grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of unintelligible sounds. Jack's vision blurred as the air around him seemed to warp and twist. Suddenly, the ground beneath Jack's feet began to tremble. The stone walls of the chamber groaned as cracks began to spread across the floor. Jack stumbled, barely able to keep his balance as the room seemed to collapse in on itself. As her hand made contact with Jack's skin, a searing pain shot through his entire body, like icy fire burning from the inside. His muscles tensed, his mind reeled, and it felt as though his very soul was being drained from him. Jack screamed, a guttural, desperate cry that echoed off the stone walls of the chamber.
No, please stop.
The pale woman's smile grew wider, her eyes gleaming with a sadistic satisfaction. Her fingers, cold and sharp like icy daggers, dug deeper into Jack's skin, pulling him toward her as though she were claiming his very essence. Jack tried to pull away, but his body wouldn't respond. His legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the cold stone floor. The air around him grew thicker, more oppressive, as the whispers returned louder this time, more insistent. They were coming from the walls, from the floor, from within his own mind. In that moment of agony, Jack's vision blurred, and the world around him seemed to twist and distort. The stone chamber began to fade, replaced by a different scene, a vision of the past. Jack found himself standing in the middle of a village, hundreds of years ago. The buildings were old, their roofs sagging under the weight of time. People walked through the streets, their faces gaunt, their eyes filled with fear. They whispered among themselves, casting nervous glances toward a large, imposing building at the edge of the village. It was the same building Jack had been managing, but in this vision, it was a place of worship, a church. As Jack's mind wandered through the vision, he saw her, the pale woman. She was walking through the village, unnoticed by the others. Her long, dark hair flowed behind her, and her pale skin seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the setting sun. Jack followed her, his heart pounding in his chest. She moved silently, her feet barely making a sound as she walked through the village. The people didn't see her, didn't acknowledge her presence, but Jack knew that they could feel her. There was an unspoken tension in the air, a palpable fear that hung over the village like a dark cloud. As the vision continued, Jack found himself standing at the entrance of the church. The pale woman stood at the altar, her eyes fixed on a group of villagers who had gathered inside. They were pleading with a priest, a man Jack recognized as Father Alden, the man who had been mentioned in the old legends. The priest's face was twisted with fear and guilt. The villagers begged him for protection, for salvation from the curse that had plagued their town. But Jack could see it in Father Alden's eyes. He knew there was nothing he could do. The pale woman had already claimed them. As the villagers huddled together, whispering prayers under their breath, the pale woman moved toward them. Her eyes were empty, her face expressionless, but Jack could feel the overwhelming sense of dread that accompanied her. The whispers grew louder, the air grew colder, and the villagers began to scream. One by one, the villagers collapsed to the ground, their faces contorted in agony as their souls were ripped from their bodies. The pale woman stood among them, her hands outstretched, as if she were absorbing their very life force. The priest fell to his knees, weeping, as the curse of the pale woman consumed them all. "Forgive me, I could not save them."
"Forgive me, I could not save them."
Jack watched in horror as the vision played out before him. The pale woman had cursed the village, trapping their souls within the walls of the church. And now, centuries later, she was still here, still claiming victims one by one. The vision faded, and Jack found himself back in the stone chamber. The pale woman stood over him, her eyes glowing with a cold, malevolent light. Jack's body ached with the searing pain of her touch, but his mind was racing. He had seen the truth. He knew what he had to do. With every ounce of strength he had left, Jack pushed himself to his feet. He stumbled toward the altar, where the ancient symbols still glowed faintly in the dim light. He remembered the legends, the stories of how Father Alden had tried to stop the curse, but had failed. But Jack wasn't going to fail. Not now,
I won't let you take me. I won't let you take anyone else.
Jack grabbed a small, ancient-looking knife that had been left on the altar, an artifact from the church's past. He knew what he had to do. He had to finish what Father Alden had started. The pale woman moved toward him, her expression unreadable, but Jack could feel her intent. She was ready to claim him, just as she had claimed the others. Jack held the knife tightly in his trembling hand. He began to chant the words he had seen in the vision, the ancient incantation that Father Alden had tried to use to banish the pale woman. The words felt foreign on his tongue, but as he spoke them, he could feel the air in the chamber shift. The pale woman paused, her eyes narrowing as the incantation filled the room. The walls of the chamber trembled, and the stone altar began to glow with a faint, ethereal light. Jack continued the chant, his voice growing louder and more confident with each word.
In nomen antiqua, ego te exorcizo, I banish you, spirit of darkness.
The pale woman let out a low, guttural hiss as the light from the altar grew brighter. Her body seemed to waver, as if she were caught between this world and the next. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he finished the incantation, raising the knife above his head. With one swift motion, Jack brought the knife down on the altar, striking the center of the glowing symbols. The room was filled with a blinding light, and Jack could hear the screams of the pale woman as she was pulled back into the darkness. When the light faded, Jack collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The chamber was silent now, the oppressive air gone. The pale woman was nowhere to be seen. Jack lay there for a long time, staring up at the ceiling, his body aching from the ordeal. He had done it. He had broken the curse. But as Jack lay there, exhausted and weak, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The building felt different, now quieter, but not in a comforting way. It was as though the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Jack closed his eyes, hoping to forget the horrors he had seen, but deep down, He knew that the pale woman's presence would never truly leave him. And as the last remnants of light faded from the stone chamber, the whispers returned, faint at first, but growing louder. The curse had been broken, but the darkness was far from gone.